Thank you again for joining us for today's webinar, When is Evidence Enough to Make a Healthcare Decision? I will now turn it over to our moderator, NPC's Chief Science Officer, Dr. Bobby Du Bois, for a few housekeeping items and introductions. Bobby?
Well, hello to everyone, and good afternoon to many of you, good morning to some of you, and for several of our speakers, good evening to you calling from across the pond. We have a wonderful hour ahead of us where we're going to chat about when is evidence enough to make a healthcare decision. We're going to be thinking about it from randomized controlled trial data that historically was published, and did anybody follow it? And if not, why not? And we're going to be also thinking about it from the standpoint of real-world evidence, observational studies, and again, understanding how is it being used or how is it not being used. And I will introduce our speakers. I believe there's a slide coming up that will tell us just that. There is a tremendous amount of focus and interest right now on big data. Big data is also synonymous often with real-world evidence, and almost any publication that you read in this space, there will be one article or another on the benefits of mining these databases, understanding how healthcare is or isn't being handled, and then making improvements thereof. And so we really want to ask the question, yes, theoretically this is all possible, but is anybody actually using these type of data to make decisions? And for some people, the greatest fear is that it won't be used, and that all the work, all the database development will be for naught. And other people fear, frankly, it's the opposite, that it will be used, and it may be used inappropriately with improper methods, and that the conclusions that might be drawn may not be correct. So many people have one fear or another. So what we would like to do is to divide the session into really three more parts. First, we're going to hear about the world of the randomized controlled trial, bodies of evidence that came out from large clinical trials, and several examples of where that data was adopted rapidly, and then examples where it was adopted rather slowly. And then we're going to turn our attention towards the real-world evidence world and actually look at a study that was recently published by IMS on real-world decisions that were made based on real-world evidence. And then we'll have a chance to do some Q&A. So we have three speakers. And our first speaker will be Dr. Eleanor Perfetto, who is a professor at the University of Maryland in the School of Pharmacy with a focus on pharmaceutical health services research. And she's going to talk about a just published study on evidence adoption and lessons to be learned from those case studies and moving forward. Then we're going to have two folks from IMS Health. We will have Dr. Ben Hughes, who is in charge of their real-world evidence solutions part of the business, and Marla Kessler, who is the vice president and in charge of their consulting group in Europe, in 9 different European offices. And Ben and Marla will talk about real-world evidence and what they found when they actually looked for examples where it was actually being used. Now, we at NPC have done a number of different projects in this space on real-world evidence, everything from looking at how you would understand a study, how you would use that to make certain decisions. We've put together CER principles and been actively involved in the GRACE principles, which particularly focus on observational studies. These are all available on the npcnow.org website, and so these are resources that if they are of interest, you can find them there for free. In addition, we have a number of things, preview of coming attractions, where we've done a payer survey of folks in the CER space to find out, are they actually using CER evidence and what are the barriers that they might perceive. We've also looked at the use of real-world evidence in clinical practice guidelines as a key vehicle for doctors to get evidence and make decisions and get guidance in that regard. We've also put together a number of tools, online tools, that would allow you to look at individual studies and make some decisions about whether they were conducted with the proper rigor, and some other frameworks that we will be coming forward with in the next number of months about looking at guidelines for the proper conduct of studies, looking at whether claims data analysis of utilization patterns show differences when CER studies have been published, and the popular topic of real-world evidence. When will the emperor have clothes? In our case, we believe real-world evidence will have a proper time. It's just a matter of when all of the capabilities will in place to do so. So with that, I believe we will next turn it over to Eleanor.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about a study that I was involved with Bobby Du Bois and Michael Lauer from the National Institutes of Health at NHLBI. And this started with a conversation that we had one day where we talked about, we kind of threw out a rhetorical question, just how much evidence is enough for decision making, for actually seeing changes that should start to happen in practice. And it was a rhetorical question in that sometimes, we said, well, sometimes one study changes everything, and sometimes it takes quite a few studies. And this conversation grew into what turned into this paper. And so I do need to acknowledge my two co-authors and the thought process that went behind this. So we were talking about what kinds of things might when you have this pace of adoption, what might be driving some of that? Is it the evidence that's behind it, or are there other factors that are involved in this thinking and in this process? And how is one driving the other, or what are some of those other influences that might be there that could be interfering with evidence coming out and driving something that should happen or something that should no longer be happening? So we were trying to do a few things. We wanted to understand the pace of evidence adoption and propose a conceptual framework for how we should be thinking about this. So what I'm about to present to you is our thinking about this conceptual framework and actually trying to test some of the ideas that we had in this conceptual framework by taking a look at 3 case studies, that of statins, drug-eluting stents, and bone marrow transplantation for breast cancer. And what we wanted to do was take a look at 3 different areas and 3 different approaches, and think about it in a way where we selected these case studies based on the fact that there was a lot of evidence behind them. There were clinical trials, multiple clinical trials that led to practices in these areas, but some were the uptake was very slow. In other areas, the uptake was very fast, and in other areas, the uptake was kind of up and down. And so we wanted to try to apply this to apply our framework to these 3 cases, so that we could see if our framework was sound, and if some of the elements that we had put in it were making sense, in that we were seeing where evidence coming forward was available, but the uptake may have gone up or down, fast or slowly, depending upon some of these other factors. And could we actually see that by walking through these cases? So our goal was to identify these critical factors and how they might be affecting adoption of the information, and to optimize the translation of this information into routine clinical practice so that they could be considered in future work. So the 5 critical factors that we thought about that might be influencing the uptake or the pace of uptake was the validity, reliability, and maturity of the science. So there was a bulk of information. It was considered very sound information coming out of clinical trials. It had been evolving over time, and there were other scientific factors, maybe biomedical factors, that were also supporting the information that came forward. The second was the communication of the information. So This is how is the information out there and getting out there. And this could be things like whether or not information was being communicated through the media. Had it made it into the newspaper, to magazines, to the evening news, or was it something that was just being communicated through normal channels of scientific literature? Another area that we thought about was the applicability, and that was the patient or the clinician's ability to actually apply this specific information to a specific clinical need, a specific clinical event. How applicable was it to them at that moment? The fourth factor was the economic drivers. Was there something that was driving this because maybe because something was not going to be paid for, it might slow down adoption, or it was easily being reimbursed, therefore it sped up adoption, or that there was some economic factor that maybe drove clinicians to make this economic choice. And then the last factor that we talked about and considered was the rapid or slow incorporation of the evidence into clinical practice guidelines. And so, like the maturity of the science, it would have an influence on practitioner behavior because it would be considered the standard of care. And so that would be what would be expected, the service that would be expected to be performed. So we took these 5 factors and we put them against our cases that we were considering. And so the first case study is that of statins. So if we begin with a discussion about the evidence that was found, we had the 1961 Framingham study. So information about cholesterol and the impact of cholesterol had actually been available since the early 1960s. And then in the 1990s, there were other very large trials that were going on that showed improvement in survival, decrease in risk when cholesterol was controlled. In 1999 and again in 2005, meta-analysis again showed the benefit and the reduction in risk. Again in 2010, meta-analysis reports of targeting levels had substantial benefit. So if you take a look at the timeline of some of these other considerations, so for example, the green is regulatory events that happened, the purple is incorporation into guidelines. So you see here that lovastatin was approved by the FDA in 1987, and then we had other approvals that had happened subsequently after that. Guideline recommendations recommending lovastatin as second-line therapy happening in 1993, and then guidelines in 2002 that were making the recommendation of statins and were reporting that they were generally safe. So you see the timeline of the evidence and the incorporation into and the availability of treatments and the incorporation into clinical practice guidelines. Here we go to the timeline of actual statin use and what was going on at that time and incorporation into practice. So we take a look at this timeline and you'll see that there were in drug therapy recommendations in only 20% of ambulatory visits in 1992, 39% in 1999, 50% in 2000, and 54% in 2006. So we do see an increase, but it's not dramatic, it's very gradual, it's been happening over time. And you can see that we go from, in 1992, 3% of Americans to, in 2010, 16%. And so you see that there has been an increase, but it's taken a number of years and certainly following slowly behind the evidence that was generated. So in terms of thinking through what factors might be driving this slower pace of adoption, there was a lot of the maturity of the science was certainly strong. There really weren't economic drivers that were causing clinicians to not treat high cholesterol. There was communication of the science in that there were certainly published studies and published meta-analyses that had this information, and there had been a relatively slow incorporation into clinical practice guidelines. And so we were, in our thinking about this, we're thinking that the most influential of the factors seemed to be that it was the maturity of the science. It took time for the science to mature, for there to be this acceptance over time for the reduction of cholesterol and the adoption into practice that this should be something that should be a first-line treatment and adopted right away. Then we'll go to case study number 2. In case study number 2, it was the use of drug-eluting stents. And again, we'll present the timeline of the evidence and the market considerations. So in the 1970s, there was an information known about cabbage being used to improve the survival of patients with cardiovascular disease. And then there were subsequent trials that actually were showing that if you used the drug-eluting stents, that there was a conflict of some of the evidence that was being seen about whether or not you would have better outcomes, or whether or not there was questionable use about using the drug-eluting stents. And so there had been a series of clinical trial data, but it wasn't necessarily building up a case in one direction or another. Again, you see when you look at the timeline of evidence and market considerations, there were only the percutaneous option available only in the early 70s, and then you see the introduction of drug-eluting stents, and you see guidelines as an alternative, guidelines updated to reflect some of the risk that was being identified in some of these clinical trials that were coming out, CMS having a DRG, hospitals finding decreasing rate of repeating procedures. And so it is in 2011 that you see that that the guidelines are starting to become a little clearer. And so there has been kind of an up and down. There was an up and down history with drug-eluting stents. And so you see with the timeline for adoption, there was also this up and down that was responding to that information coming out. So you see that 50% of all the procedures involved the implementation of the drug-eluting stent, jumping to as high as 90 in 2005, and then slowly dropping down again after the reports of the risk that might be involved. So again, with this case study, we took a look at what we thought were the influential factors. Highly influential was the maturing science. More information was coming out. Clinical trials data were available, and that were outlining some of the risks that were involved. Ability to apply the published scientific findings, not quite as much as some of the other factors like the maturity of the science. There was also some of the economic drivers behind this, some of the cost that was involved, and certainly some of the considerations about that were coming forward about some of the ways that hospitals were purchasing some of these products. And then the communication of the science. Again, lots of information that was coming out about risk at the time that some of these trials were reporting their results. And so that was also very influential. And we came down on believing that there were three components that were really driving some of the up and down that we were seeing in the timeline with this. And then the third case study, which is for bone marrow transplantation for breast cancer, which was highly controversial. And you see in the 1970s it was being used in leukemia. It was being tried in patients with metastatic breast cancer in the 1980s. And then there were randomized controlled trials that showed that there was no benefit that actually happened in the 1990s, late 1990s. Along with the market and the evolution of the guidelines, there was enthusiasm by some of the key opinion leaders, and there were lots of legal challenges where some of the insurance companies were refusing to pay for experimental therapy, but because of some of the publicity and the lawsuits, then coverage was happening because of that media attention that was happening and because of some of the legal issues that were going on. And then as there was more information that came out about the lack of effectiveness, then you saw that organizations would again begin to refuse reimbursement for those procedures. So again, if you take a look at what we saw in terms of the use that was happening over time, when we had the information that 3 of the 4 randomized trials showed that there was no benefit, then there was the dramatic drop-off that happened by 2002, where at that point it was only 118 women, and it was a 97% fall from the peak use that had been seen in 1999. So again, taking this as a case study and taking a look at it across the factors, the validity of the data, the reliability of the science, certainly there was a very dramatic period of 3 out of 4 trials that changed the thinking, where it had been largely anecdotal till that point. It was the ability to apply those published findings right away. Again, that issue of applicability, when those findings came out, there was an immediate drop because patients and clinicians had the immediate ability to make a decision to stop using the procedure. There were certainly economic drivers once there would no longer be reimbursement, and then the communication of the science. This got a lot of attention, and that had a lot to do with the publicity around some of the things that had happened in the 90s when patients were being refused therapy, and now the media attention to finding out that therapy actually wasn't working. So we had singled out or actually zeroed in on the validity and reliability of the science and the communication as being the things that were really driving the pace of adoption. So the implications from this conceptual model that we constructed is that this was exploratory and it was done with a very limited sample, but it indicates that these conceptual factors might be very useful to understanding and accelerating research translation, that we can certainly improve dissemination and translation by considering these experiences with how and when past research was adopted. We would like to see continued development of this proposed framework, certainly by us and by others contributing to the thought process behind this. And as federal government, we'll be supporting CER through PCOR, and that's going to continue to grow. And there certainly is a huge dissemination component to all of that we think it can benefit from taking a look at this kind of research to really begin to zero in on those factors, those important factors that are driving adoption or maybe obstructing adoption in some way, and learning more about those so that we can learn how to utilize those to certainly speed adoption of important information as it becomes available.
Thanks so much, Eleanor. And now we'd like to turn it over to a discussion of real-world evidence and when it's being used worldwide. And let me turn it over first to Ben and then to Marla.
Thank you very much, Robert. Before we dive into some of them, sharing some of the insights from the white paper, I think it's actually quickly worth sharing what RWE means to IMS, and therefore a little bit some of the drivers of why we developed this significant research. Obviously, we're probably fairly well known in the industry, but what may be less well known is that RWE is one of the core ways that we serve clients and a strategic investment area for IMS in general. And I think we can illustrate that with a couple of concrete examples. So if, for instance, we advance to the next slide, some of the things that we've done at IMS recently are creating data sets in Europe like HDI-CPRD, which give unique research potential because they connect acute and ambulatory care. Investments in data in the US for such as health plan claims to create what is definitely now the richest and deepest data set for RWE in the US, or investments such as our partnership with Remedy to actually have the tools on top of those data sets so that our clients can get the full leverage from them. So all of these kind of investments means that we actually have the privilege of serving the majority of the industry around this topic. But one of the things in those relationships that we have is there was a number of common questions coming up at various levels of the organization. And the questions were orientated really around two core themes. One is, even if we're fairly committed to our real-world evidence strategy, where are the examples of where this has worked, and how do I follow those examples so that we can have impact in what we're doing? But there was also a common question, which is how do we how do we align the organization around our RWE efforts and investments? Because there are so many different perspectives and actually people who had more or less buy-in to different approaches. And of course, there is actually very little information that can help on that, only anecdotal case studies. And those anecdotal case studies are actually very difficult to interpret. And we'll illustrate that actually just using Nexium as an example. So if we just move to the next slide, Nexium is an example use of RWE that the actors involved, AZ and some of the payers, both cited that RWE was actually used to influence some of the decisions around formulary status. And if you're not one of those actors, what could you actually learn outside in from that case study? Well, let's just give a quick brief overview of what you'd know outside in. You'd know that Nexium was on a good trajectory on 2003. Obviously, there some generic competition came into play. And in 2005, AHRQ did the first comparative effectiveness review on PPIs. And actually, the result of that review, which was mainly based on clinical trials and systematic review, said these were equally effective. And then shortly after, United Healthcare decides to drop Nexium from the formulary status. And obviously, they get there's quite a lot of noise around that decision for United Healthcare, and they actually use RWE to justify that the decision was right, that they found no statistically adverse impacts from patients switching from Nexium to other PPIs. And this had a ripple effect to TRICARE, and then even through formulary status under challenge all the way through to 2008 when WellPoint also started to drop. Then there was a little bit of a reversal in trend, and AstraZeneca publishes a claims analysis that shows increased costs from switching in a poster. WellPoint changes their decision, and there's actually other evidence than RWE that creates additional support for Nexium that's actually entering into play. So actually that decline in formulary status change, and actually the trend reverses to a certain extent. And then another review was done by AHRQ in 2011, the one that kind of initiated this, but actually very little of this RWE is used. The RWE from database that's used is mainly around surgical evaluation and safety. Actually, these two studies are not included in the review. And then finally, in 2012, AstraZeneca actually formally published this study in a peer-reviewed journal. So it's very difficult to understand exactly what happened there. The actors involved said RWE has played an influence on many of the decisions, and they publicly stated that. However, lots of inconsistency in terms of that same RWE is not being used in the actual comparative effectiveness review. And so actually there's two ways to interpret this, and we actually illustrate this a little bit with the notion of skeptics and evangelists. Skeptics could look at this case study and say, actually for the payers, this was just about justifying cost containment, that actually RWE is not really being used beyond safety, and so there's not really a kind of need for a proactive agenda. It's just looking at the case study. Or you could be an evangelist and you could say, wow, AstraZeneca really managed to turn the tide of what was happening there, and for actually what were extremely low investments, addressed brand value of very significant value that was at stake. And so you can interpret that in two ways. And that is the reason why we initiated this research, was to say, all right, we need more than just anecdotal case studies, and help either the skeptics or evangelists understand what is happening really in terms of RWE use. How do we do this? Well, the main way was we had over 50 discussions with payers, HTA experts, and clients across 10 geographies, and developed what is a database now that well exceeds 100 examples of where we know RWE, because someone was familiar with the matter, actually had influence on a decision. And you can see, that's actually pretty widespread in terms of across oncology, specialty, and primary care. So very interesting to see that there are a very significant number of decisions being made. And this actually corrects some of the misconceptions, particularly probably more in the skeptic camp and supporting the evangelist camp. And what I mean by that, the skeptic would have said, this is more mainly about mandatory submissions and safety. It's not really about coverage decisions, etc. Well, that's not true. We've actually managed to identify over 100 case studies that are not related to safety. The skeptic would also say, hey, the payers set the agenda, and you can't be proactive about this. Well, that's not actually true either. In all of these, across these case studies, more than 25% actually were initiated by the manufacturers. So there is the ability really to shape this agenda and be an actor. The idea that actually payers are just doing this for cost containment is also challenged, because we see a number of case studies where payers actually expanded the use of medicines where the RWE convinced them there was more value. And the final thing that we often heard is, okay, even if we believe in RWE, the strategies have to be different across every country completely, because the local environments are completely different. Yes, there is certain elements of truth in that, in terms of you have to localize those strategies. But what we'll show later on is there are actually 4 fundamental types of market that can actually help define types of strategies and therefore drive more value from RWE investments. Let's dive a little bit more. Deeper into some of the insights we had in the paper. And our objective wasn't just profiling the case studies, but also to develop some kind of language that manufacturers can use to actually understand what's happening across markets. And so we examined a couple of dimensions of real-world evidence use. One was more on the supply side. So where across those countries can I actually get hold of the data through routine databases to actually generate evidence? And of course, we looked at the demand side, which was more orientated around, okay, in which countries are these case studies actually being seen in terms of decision making? And you can see on the supply side that we're looking at here, there are 2 kind of sub-dimensions. One is does that country have useful data? So it's got great coverage, it's linked, has deep clinical depth, and actually can I use it? And you can see that varies very highly across countries. And actually for the US in particular, it's been traditionally behind countries in Europe who have had a long historical EMR adoption. It's catching up today, but the main advantage of the US is the market for data. So the actual accessibility of the data in the US is extremely high. The other dimension, of course, we looked at was more the demand side, and this is the case studies, the number of case studies and by type across all the countries. And you can see the volume that we were able to identify varied very differently across the markets. However, it's not just about volume. If you look at Italy, for instance, there were more case studies identified in Italy than anywhere else. But a lot of these were about launch access or coverage of EVA's development, managed entry schemes. And the reality in Italy is potentially some of those schemes haven't had the impact that they were expected to have when they were actually initially negotiated and introduced. By contrast, if you look at the UK, which has less case studies, those ones actually have a very big variety. And when those decisions have been made, they've actually applied to the majority of the patient population in that country, which is not necessarily the case in the US. So you have to look a little bit deeper across these in order to understand to what extent is that RWE being used in that country. So what we did is we took that and we said, right, let's make an assessment scale across these countries and understand which country really is having the most impact from RWE. And we talked about the data supply, and we talked about the application decisions being made. There's one other missing component to really understand, or important component to understand what's going on, and we've called it frameworks. And what do we mean by this? This is you generate a piece of evidence from a database, and you want a decision to be made. What are the channels that you can use to take that evidence to a decision? And those channels actually can be are pretty varied. Obviously, everybody naturally thinks about HTA or reimbursement decisions and coverage decisions, but there are actually other channels where RWE can influence medicine's use. For instance, in the development of clinical guidelines, such as by the AH, or comparative effectiveness reviews, such as by the AHRQ, or by the use of prescribing indicators that fundamentally are using RWE to ensure appropriate prescribing. Or there's a dissemination actually into the market by the manufacturer of that particular evidence. They're all different channels that can actually influence the drug use. And taking that kind of score, you can see the kind of ranking that we developed across these countries, with UK at the top, Spain probably the least impact, and US in the group of leaders, but are actually not entirely in the lead. So UK, even though it's probably the market that's having seen the most impact, you'll also notice that we only gave it a score of 11 out of 20. And the reason for that is, even though it's the leading market, there was lots more scope for the UK to actually being both supplying data to generate evidence and actually using those evidence to make decisions. But what we'll do to understand these dimensions a little bit more is we'll just deep dive on the US and explain a little bit the scoring that we gave to the US. And so at this point...
Hi, Ben. Thank you. So to walk you through the data supply discussion in the U.S., I think it's useful just to remember that it has a different history than the other markets do, creating supply of real-world data. Specifically in the U.S., it was really commercially driven. A lot of this information was provided by data generators, really as a way to increase revenues. So most of the data is claims data. It was made available with minimal restrictions of how it could be used outside of protecting patients' confidentiality, and it created opportunities for third parties to really work to make the data easily accessible to a broad population. So given the vast amount of data that was being generated by multiple payers in the U.S., the third parties working to make sure that the data would be easily accessible, and now with the increase of EMR and other technologies that are generating more data in the U.S., it was easily the most distinctive market on data supply. But as Ben explained, that supply is really only half the story. So when we look and move forward to think about what happens next in terms of the demand frameworks, this might seem counterintuitive to people. When you look at the bubble that was on one of the earlier slides on data supply, it looked like a lot of the data was being generated and used by people within the market. But what you actually see is, although there's certainly a lot of demand for the data itself, there's not clarity about how it should be applied. And it's probably easiest to see this if you compare it to other markets. So in the UK, for example, you can take real-world data and bring it directly to physicians. The dissemination is very clear and very open, whereas in the US, it's much more restricted. And in a market like France, where they've actually developed a pretty explicit playbook for comparative cost-effectiveness using real-world evidence, it becomes pretty clear to see that the U.S. doesn't have anything that explicit for people who are developing real-world evidence in hopes of influencing decisions made about their products. So knowing that we don't have clarity around demand, it's interesting to look at the next slide and see applications, because there you can start to appreciate the ability to generate a lot of the evidence to make your own decisions, which we see from insurers in the U.S. and some provider groups. But at the same time, because of the fragmentation of the U.S. market, the impact of any one of those real-world evidence studies is pretty limited. The Nexium case that Ben went through is a nice example of how it does have some broader impact, but again, it tends to be limited to an individual insurer-by-insurer decision. And so for that reason, the U.S. is still fairly early in its ability to demonstrate that real-world evidence is really influencing demand and practice. But the variety at least gives you a sense of how many different ways real-world evidence could be used to influence decisions in the U.S. in the future. So the next obvious question then that comes from this is, where is the potential implications for pharma, and understanding how should this inform the pharma strategies? From our perspective, it makes sense to step back from the aggregate score of the market and to really think about supply and demand separately. And when we did that, we ended up with 4 segments of market archetypes, and this is what Ben was describing earlier. For the markets where you see the most robust supply, as defined both by access and the usability of the data, and then you combine that with very clear demand frameworks and evidence of actual use, you have what we call the pioneer market. And those are markets where it's just real-world evidence is most evolved. So you can see how real-world evidence is being used. Your stakeholders have a sophisticated way of thinking about it, applying it. There's probably fewer degrees of freedom about how you can generate the real-world evidence to influence their decision-making, but there's still opportunities to use real-world evidence in a broader way. Here we find clients are really trying to play catch-up to engage credibly with real-world evidence because the stakeholders are so much more sophisticated. Markets, which we're calling the explore markets, and there you see demand, supply is more limited. It's slightly more of an access issue than a usefulness issue, but there's still room to grow in both dimensions. But the demand for real-world evidence here is still fairly narrow, even though it's becoming clearer. So in France, you see it around cost effectiveness. In Italy, you see it to support launch access. And there we find that clients are really looking for help understanding how do you prepare for the market going forward. Because the question we have within IMS Health is the Explore bucket really sustainable? Because over time, as you develop more experience and more comfort with using real-world evidence to make decisions, it seems natural that you would apply it more broadly. And in a market like Italy, where you've collected data but maybe haven't applied it as consistently after launch, there's growing pressure to use the wealth of data that you have to make different decisions. So those markets, from our perspective, tend to be ones that we think are going to be in motion, and so we help clients figure out how do you prepare for that, and even how do you make some strategic bets depending on how it would move forward. The markets that we have in the laggard markets represent those both with low demand and low supply, but we don't want to say that real-world evidence is irrelevant there. It's just that in each of these markets, we have seen at least 1 or 2 different funds or provinces or other stakeholders who are looking at using real-world evidence to current decision-making today. It's just not at a market level that you're seeing it consistently used. So for these markets in the laggard bucket, we tend to think about that as one of targeted engagement and really trying to work through how you work with those people, those stakeholders who are interested in bringing real-world evidence forward and maybe influencing other people. And then that brings us to the trader market, where you see the U.S. is the sole market represented here, although we have a hypothesis that we might see this play out in some Eastern European markets as well. And again, it's just that data is seen as an asset to be sold. So people haven't put rigid expectations around how that data should be used to develop evidence. But again, once that rich supply of data is available, the applications and value you can imagine deriving from it is significant. And for us, it's one of the more exciting markets to consider. So when we look at the trader market in more detail, what we think about is that in these markets, you have the ability to know your products, your stakeholders, your diseases, an unprecedented level of depth. And for us, this means that you can finally create some internal alignment around the current situation. So it means that people who sit on the medical side or the commercial side, and even people who sit in finance can all share the same picture of what's happening in the marketplace to inform decisions. And so we think it leads to efficiencies and better effectiveness on clinical development, but also certainly around commercial activities such as marketing and even just how you think about portfolio management and business development. Probably the bigger impact, though, is really the ability to engage differently with your stakeholders. Because part of the challenge that you have when you work with payers or you work with clinicians and you're thinking about launching a new product or you're thinking about influencing treatment patterns is that people start off with different fact bases. And although everyone is entitled to their own opinion, to paraphrase, we certainly believe that we should be sharing a common fact base using real-world evidence. And so in the U.S., we think that we're in a unique position to be able to do that. And for the people who are moving faster in this space, we think that not only will you have the common fact base that informs your decisions, but it increases your external credibility with markets. The piece that is important to understand, though, is that companies are already doing this pretty effectively, and we do have a client who's using it in oncology. And they're able to not only align their entire organization around what's happening in specific tumors, but they're now seen as the go-to source for information around real-world evidence for oncology. We have another example that's been publicly announced for Novartis, and what they're doing is using an integrated data mart for MS. I won't go into all the details here, but what's pretty interesting to understand about this example is that although they had a rich set of EMR data that they could use as part of their integrated backbone, for people familiar with EMR, you know that it's an incomplete view of the patient. If in a disease like MS, they might be treated by a different caregiver when they suffer from depression, which is a common comorbidity. Or it's incomplete when MS affects productivity, and so really being able to look at insurance claims is important to have the whole picture of the impact of the disease. And certainly with a lot of more RCTs coming out that are being invested in, you want to be able to couple what you're seeing in practice with what people believe is coming out from the clinical trials. So I won't go through the details of all of these markets. The reason we have this slide is just to show you that excellence can exist in all the different market archetypes. And so from our perspective, it's important as an organization to think globally, but know that you can have different approaches based on the capabilities and the current appetite for real-world evidence in the market. And the conversations that we see with clients that we're supporting ourselves are focused on people building the kind of data marts that Novartis is so that they can have a better understanding of the market, but have a more proactive role play in decisions about treatment paradigms moving forward. We see clients launching training programs and other internal education programs to get RWE fluency up, but also to get the most out of the investments that they've already made in RWE. Because there's nothing worse than spending millions of dollars on a study that people don't know how to communicate with stakeholders, or even just to build innovative platforms like those that can support pay for performance or innovative contracting. And so we really do see the world moving forward in a variety of ways using real-world evidence. And so we are happy to make our paper available to anyone interested in it. We go into more detail about the markets and the methodologies, and we have the case library there. So feel free to go to our website or contact us.
Well, now we can turn to the question section. So those of you who have questions, please submit them. Well, the first question goes to Eleanor, and it has to do with applicability. And, isn't there always applicability? And can you give an example of where a study or a series of studies would not be particularly applicable to changes in clinical practice?
Yeah, good question. Applicability really, I think in theory, all of the studies are applicable to various kinds of patients, but I think applicability in the way that we were applying it was really more, can somebody actually use this information right now? And so it may be that they might be restricted in some way because a particular surgical procedure is not available where they live. They'd have to travel very far, that kind of thing. So it was really more the immediacy of the applicability is what we were thinking about. Thinking about things like, well, if a patient really, if it's very applicable to a patient, so for example, if something came out in the news that there was a particular side effect that was extremely frightening to patients, the patients could stop taking the medication that they have in their hand right now. They can make that decision right away, and the immediacy of that. Where the flip of that might be that if a study comes out and says that a particular medication has substantial efficacy on a particular issue or particular disease, but it's only available by prescription, then the patient has to go to a doctor. They have to talk to the doctor and have a doctor prescribe it for them. The doctor may try other therapies first. So it was really kind of more the immediacy of the availability of action, or the ability to act, is what we were thinking about in terms of applicability.
That's wonderful. The next question really relates to kind of the evolution of real-world evidence. So the folks from IMS, you looked at sort of what's going on today. Can you project out into the future with the growth in partnerships between payers, like a WellPoint or a Humana, and industry, where you're seeing these sort of collaborations come up? Presumably they will have the opportunity to mine real-world data from those payer environments. Do you see that type of analysis driving more change in medical management decisions or benefit design decisions than we've seen in the past?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think, in principle, I'd say the answer would be yes, we would expect that to increase fairly rapidly over time. I mean, the payers that we spoke to expressed the desire to use this kind of evidence more. I think and we're actually definitely seeing in certain markets the increased application. If we had done this kind of scan a number of years ago, we would have come up with a handful of case studies. Now we're coming up with over 100 case studies. There are some things that need to obviously slot into place to make that happen, and some of the challenges that we're seeing that are ongoing to that actually seeing that rapid uptake is obviously the science and the methods behind it. This is something that obviously everybody who's involved in the development of real-world evidence is very conscious of the ongoing efforts to say, what are the standards that will need to be applied in order to develop those pieces of evidence. That is, and actually to know what is its worth and where it should be used. And that is an ongoing effort, and actually is improving over time. So that's going to be one of the key enablers. The other thing that we will see, and this is probably a trend that people is less around benefits design. What we're going to see very much for the manufacturing industry in terms of a trend over the next couple of years is the use of that same data and evidence more for internal decision making across the different functions. And that's probably something that we've actually seen very much in the last year, last 2 years, as that massive expansion of data sets that were previously seen to be data sets for epidemiologists and outcome research departments are now actually data sets that are for all departments and functions across the organization.
So we have basically 2 minutes. So this is the lightning round. So each of you, IMS gets a minute, and Eleanor, you have a minute. What about direct-to-consumer advertising? Is that going to influence uptake, and would you expect to see differences across markets where that's either more or less common? Start with you, Eleanor.
Well, I think we certainly have evidence that direct-to-consumer marketing has had an impact on use, and so I think it's important for there to be information out there and for patients to be able to have access to it. I think in terms of whether or not it has a significant impact on uptake or makes a big change in uptake, I think it really depends on a lot of the other factors that we talked about, the applicability, whether or not there's that kind of access that they can get it, whether or not the evidence is there that if they have a conversation with the clinician will write the prescription, the economic factors that we brought in. So it's not the only thing that would have an influence on uptake, but certainly would be positive.
And Ben or Marla, a 1-minute answer that you guys would like to add.
Yes, I think what real-world evidence enables you to do is to improve your DTC. So in the past, we've talked about DTC based on what Pharma has been able to provide, and often driven by RCTs. and some market research. The beauty of RWE is that you can really understand what's happening in the patient world, both in terms of how they're treated, but also using social media to understand what questions they're asking and what interest in information that they have. And so from our perspective, it creates a better understanding of what the patient really needs to hear, which should make better DTC, and then lead you to be able to provide them more compelling information to answer those questions.
Well, thank you, Eleanor Perfetto, Marla Kessler, and Ben Hughes for your insights into the topic. For those of you who enjoyed this, you can listen to it yet again. It's archived or will be archived shortly on NPC's website, and if there are colleagues that you think might enjoy it, it will also be available for all as well, free. And if you have any questions that you didn't get a chance to ask or things that pop up over the next day or two or three, we have everyone's email address, and if you don't copy this down quickly and don't have a chance to do that, that will also be up on the website. So thank you all, and we look forward to joining you on future webinars.